Well, welcome. And let's get started. A regular rhythm. But otherwise,
Okay, so maybe I should just tell Rebecca, just check, I'll wait to hear back.
I want to start with a kind of meditation today. Lectio Divina is a way of finding the divine in the word. Now, in words. And typically, Lectio Divina is conducted with scripture. But we're going to do a little different Lectio Divina today. We're going to do it with a parable. It is not Jesus' parable, but it is Tagore's parable. And so I'm going to ask you, first of all, just let's have a prayer before we start. Then we'll get started with the Lectio Divina. Holy One who knows our thoughts, who knows our hearts, and who knows what we need to know. Open our minds and open our hearts to the ways that others have found to find you in the world. Thank you for each soul that is here and for each word that is spoken and each word that is received from you. In the name of the one who taught us who you are. So just a little introduction. When Dick first asked me if I would be willing to teach something, he said, which one would you like? And I knew nothing about Nan Shepherd. And so that was my first choice because I did not know her. And then I had used a lot of Rabindranath's work in my work. And so a lot of times his words are just the words that are needed for people to be able to reach into the spiritual world. A lot of the people that I work with do not consider themselves of any religion, but instead consider themselves spiritual, but not religious. And Tagore's words are really very deeply spiritual. And he teaches a lot about Christianity, but he teaches a lot about how Christianity has been misinterpreted, how we have misinterpreted Jesus' words, particularly in the West, because we don't have the Western way of thinking. So as I go through, we'll start to see a lot of that. He believed that there was in himself that of God, and that there was in all of us that of God. And there was in everything in creation that of God. So there was no separation between human beings having some special connection to God that we all do. And I know the Quakers have a saying, there is that of God in everyone. And he extends that to there is that of God in everyone and in every creature and in every part of creation. So that's where we're going to be starting with Tagore. He really believed that education needed to be happening up in front, under the cathedral of the sun. And he repeats that often. So we're going to start with a Lectio Divina, and Lectio Divina is a way of reading or hearing something numerous times. And each time you are listening for how the divine is speaking to you while you hear what is being said in words. So we will hear it 4 times, and I will give instructions for what you are to hear for, or to listen for, or what you are to do to place yourself into the story. And as you place yourself in the story, you are actually there. But in this case, I'm going to ask you to be a character in the story. So upon the first reading, I would like you to choose whether you would like to be the bird, a person coming to see the bird, or one of the teachers. So let us hear the first reading. You might want to close your eyes to read more intently and to get rid of any kind of distractions. And if that's uncomfortable for you, simply gaze downward. Once upon a time, there was a bird. It was ignorant. It sang all right, but never recited scriptures. It hopped pretty frequently, but lacked manners. So it was decided that the bird needed a sound schooling. Its ignorance, of course, was due to its natural habitat. So a suitable cage had to be built for the bird, and a magnificent cage it was, gilded and decorated, so much so that people came from far and wide to admire it. Books were purchased and manuscripts piled high to force feed the bird. Its throat was so completely choked with leaves from the books that it could neither whistle nor whisper. But still, sometimes in the early morning, it would flutter its wings in a reprehensible sort of way. So its wings were clipped, and the teachers set about educating the bird with a textbook in one hand and a strap in the other. When finally the bird died, nobody noticed for the longest time. For was it not a good thing to have a quiet bird that didn't hop about uncontrollably? Upon the second reading, I would like you to choose to be another character. I would like to choose you to choose to be another character. The bird, one of the onlookers who comes to see the bird, or one of the teachers. Put yourself into the story as that character. Once upon a time, there was a bird. It was ignorant. It sang all right, but never recited scriptures. It hopped pretty frequently, but lacked manners. So it was decided that the bird needed a sound schooling. Its ignorance, of course, was due to its natural habitat. So a suitable cage had to be built for the bird. And a magnificent cage it was, gilded and decorated, so much so that people came from far and wide to admire. Books were purchased and manuscripts piled high to force feed the bird. Its throat was so completely choked with leaves from the books that it could neither whistle nor whisper. But still, sometimes in the early morning, it would flutter its wings in a reprehensible sort of way. So its wings were clipped, and the teachers set about educating the bird with a textbook in one hand and a strap in the other. When finally the bird died, nobody noticed for the longest time. For was it not a good thing to have a quiet bird that didn't hop about uncontrollably? For the third reading, choose the one character that you have not been yet, either the bird or the people who come from far and wide to see it, or one of the teachers. Put yourself in the story. Once upon a time, there was a bird. It was ignorant. It sang all night, but never recited scriptures. It hopped pretty frequently, but lacked manners. So it was decided that the bird needed a sound schooling. Its ignorance, of course, was due to its natural habitat. So a suitable cage had to be built for the bird, and a magnificent cage was gilded and decorated, so much so that people came from far and wide to admire it. Books were purchased and manuscripts piled high to force feed the bird. Its throat was so completely choked with leaves from the books that it could neither whistle nor whisper. But still, sometimes in the early morning, it would flutter its wings in a reprehensible sort of way. So its wings were clipped, and the teachers set about educating the bird, with a textbook in one hand and a strap in the other. When finally the bird died, nobody noticed for the longest time. For was it not a good thing to have a quiet bird that didn't hop about uncontrollably? And now in final reading, you simply put yourself into the story, listen to the words, and listen to the message that you receive from the Holy Spirit in the reading and in the silence that follows. Once upon a time, there was a bird. It was ignorant. It sang all right, but never recited scriptures. It hopped pretty frequently, but lacked manners. So it was decided that the bird needed a sound schooling. Its ignorance, of course, was that to its natural habitat. So a suitable cage had to be built for the bird, and a magnificent cage it was, gilded and decorated, so much so that people came from far and wide to admire. Books were purchased and manuscripts piled high to force feed the bird. Its throat was so completely choked with leaves from the books that it could neither whistle nor whisper. But still, sometimes in the early morning, it would flutter its wings to a reprehensible sort of way. So its wings were clipped, and the teachers set about educating the bird, with a textbook in one hand and a strap in the other. When finally the bird died, nobody noticed for the longest time. For was it not a good thing to have a quiet bird that didn't hop about uncontrolled? Bring yourself back gently to the present, remembering that Spirit can speak to us in many ways, and the message that you receive. Rabindranath Tagore was born in 1861 and lived until 1941. He was the generation before Muslims. And he lived in a time of great unrest. He became one of the major influences on the independence that India was able to gain from the British rule. So he had an exciting time. So he was born in Kolkata in Bengal, which is now Bangladesh and the Indian state of West Bengal. He was born into a Brahmin family. Brahmin is the highest caste in the Indian caste system. And that is the caste that has much wisdom, spiritual wisdom, and usually the priests came from that caste. So Brahmin was an elitist group, and he was very much a part of that. And his family had vast estates all over that whole area of what was then called Bengal. He was a playwright, a composer, a painter, a social reformer, but most of all, he was known to be a poet. He was homeschooled by his father, and he lived in a very well-known family. His father was one of the major adherers of the Hindu religion, and so taught his children not only the English, the Western culture, but the Bengali culture and the Bengali culture under Hinduism. His mother or his sister was the first female Bengali novelist, and his brother was a painter, a musician, a newspaper editor, and playwright. Pretty upstanding thing. He married in 1883. Mrinalini Devi was 10 years old. And I've been doing some reading in Indian culture, and that was very typical at the time. That 10 years old was the time when you did go with your husband's family and live with them for the rest of your life. They had 3 sons and 2 daughters. And Mrinalini died in 1902. They were married almost 20 years, and she was only 30 years old. In 1890, while he was overseeing all of these estates, he began to recognize that he was noticing the kind of living conditions that the peasants were living under, and that the people who were below his system or his caste were really struggling, and he had a heart for them. And so his writing began to show that heart for the realistic country, the realism of what was happening in his country, and particularly the difference between, or the rift in, the Muslim and Hindu religions. By 1912, he had translated into English a collection of poems that was called the Gitanjali. And when that was published, the poet William Butler Yeats was very moved by his poetry and took his poetry into the Western world. And that was the beginning of his being acknowledged as a poet, otherwise than being the Bengali bard. And in 1913, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And then in 1915, he was knighted by King George V, and now known as the poet of humanity. He became internationally known, and for the next 3 decades, he traveled over the world, and yet he missed his India. He writes, "The winter sun is sweet, the green is luxuriant all around me. I want to be gloriously idle and let my thoughts melt and mingle in the blue of space. I am beginning even to envy the birds that sing and gladly would go without. He believed it was really important, it was part of his mission to help the West be reminded that Christianity had its origins in the East, and that Eastern wisdom and its sense of humanity's union with the divine was what Jesus taught. And that became a real focus for him in his writings. He writes, "It is a tragedy that Christianity has been linked to the might and power of empire and privilege. It has deprived people of India and so many other countries in the world of true contact with the wisdom of Jesus." In his writings, he was able to show that the East had a sense of kinship with the natural world, whereas the West was a product of city wall mentality, empire-based, natural world viewed as hostile to be subdued and to prize from the earth fruits and harvests of her resources. And you realize that his viewpoint comes from the British rule and how they viewed India and how they viewed the one thing that he loved so much. He was able to see the infinite, capital I, infinite in the finite, divine within human, heaven within the earth. And he wrote, "We had a small garden attached to the house. It was a fairyland to me, where miracles of beauty were everyday occurrences. Almost every morning in the early hour of the dusk, I would run out from my bed in a great hurry to greet the first pink flush of the dawn through the shivering branches of the palm trees which stood in a line along the garden boundary, while the grass glistened as the dewdrops caught the easy earliest tremor of the morning breeze. The sky seemed to bring to me the call of a personal companionship, and all my heart, my whole body, in fact, used to drink in as a draught the overflowing light and peace of those silent hours. I was anxious never to miss a single morning, because each one was precious to me. I had been blessed with that sense of wonder which gives a child his right of entry into the treasure house of mystery in the depths of existence." By 1916, he was traveling in the United States, and from his hotel room in Los Angeles, he wrote, "It is exhausting to be so much on the move, but I am willing, because it is God's will that I bring my message here. That is why God has steered my boat to these shores without prior notice. I accept his will." While his family no longer really practiced the Hindu, he did retain the practice of meditation in the living cathedral of the natural world. "Be still, my heart. These great trees are prayers. I can say with certainty that there is something that is living in me. It is a feeling of mystery, not a dogma. God is the soul within all souls." The turning point in his life and in his life as a social reformer and protester to the British rule in India came in 1919. And at one time, there was a peaceful crowd in the Julian of Norwich Gardens, and this was called the Amritsar Massacre. The people were in the gardens, they were peacefully protesting, and there were others who had come in who were pilgrims going home from the Golden Temple. So they were just coming through the gardens. And the farmers and merchants were there attending a trade fair in the gardens. The gardens were walled on all three sides, and then at the entrance, British troops came in And without notice, they fired for 10 minutes with machine guns. And the people began to run, and they were trampled, and there was a well in the garden, and some even leapt into the well and drowned. 1,000 people died that day, and the British reported only 2. Immediately, Tagore renounced his knighthood from the British Empire, and he wrote to Lord Chelmsford, "I wish to stand shorn of all special distinctions by the side of those of my countrymen who, for their so-called insignificance, suffer degradation not fit for human beings." Those words were reported throughout the world. And this was the turning point in the world's awareness of the injustices of the British rule in India. It marked the beginning of the end of the British rule. He says, "I am determined to plant the seed of world humanity." In all of his writings, he retains an awareness of God in the poorest, the lowliest, and the lost, and exhorts those who are the pious and religious. One exhortation: "Leave this chanting and singing and telling of beads. Whom dost thou worship in this lonely, dark corner of a temple with doors all shut? Open thine eyes and see thy God is not before thee. He is there where the tiller is tilling hard ground, and where the path maker is breaking stones. He is with them in sun and in shower, and his garment is covered with dust. Put off thy holy mantle, and even like him, come down on the dusty soil. Come out of the meditations and leave aside thy flowers and incense. What harm is there if thy clothes become tattered and stained? Meet him and stand by him in toil and the sweat of thy brow." During these 30 years, he founded a school, and this school did not allow textbooks. He was very much against textbooks, as you remember in the Parent's Tale, that he believed that the earth and the outdoors could do the most teaching. And so he founded this wonderfully successful school, and he called it a living cathedral of the natural world. And it was called Shantiniketan. It nurtured wisdom and an awareness of the spiritual world as the heart of this world. And he writes of Shantiniketan: "The mysteries of the inarticulate rocks, the rushing waters, and the dark whispers of the forest have infused India's sense of relationship with the cosmos." He believed that the greatest liberator of self, or the ego, is love. Love. And that love is the realization of the divine in every human being and every creature. That the more we love, the more we are set free in action. Love in action. Those of you who follow Richard Rohr, his devotionals and his writing, know that the center for contemplation and action, Richard Rohr says the most important word of that title is aim. You cannot have contemplation alone, nor can you have action, but you need both. And that's exactly what Tagore was: love in action. And he writes, "I believe in a spiritual world, not as anything separate from the world, but as its innermost truth. God is the heart within our heart, the soul within our soul, the light within all life. The elements of earth, air, fire, and water are seen not simply as physical phenomena. They are embodiments of spirit. Love brings into our lives suffering, and with it, God the soul within our souls. He experienced a great deal of suffering. His mother died when he was 14. And before he even married, his brother had married a woman that he was very fond of, and she committed suicide. And that brought him a great deal of suffering. His wife died when she was only 30. And in rapid succession of 1 year, his father, one of his daughters, and his youngest son. So that much grief and suffering, you can see that when he says, I realized gradually that life must be seen through the window of death in order to reach the truth. He knew what he was talking about. From infancy, my communion with the universe has been through India. His greatest love was India. And it brought him close to Mohandas Gandhi. He was the one who first named Gandhi Mahatma, which means great son. And Mahatma Gandhi named him Guru Dev, which means luminous guru, shining teacher. He believed that the purpose of religion was really to help us touch the divine in our depths and to awaken our spiritual nature, not to be our spiritual nature, just to awaken. And he says the infinite is to be seen in the sunlight, in the gladness of springtime, the repose of a winter morning, in the beauty of a human face, and the wealth of human love. On August 7, 1941, very shortly after his 80th birthday, he died in an upstairs bedroom of the home where he was born in Kolkata. Before his death, written in his final birthday message to humanity, to change for the better, he wrote the essay, Crisis in Civilization. In The Crisis in Civilization, a couple of excerpts. The world is waiting for a country that loves God and not merely herself. The God of humanity has arrived at the gates of the ruined temples of the tribe. I am determined to plant the seed of world humanity. It is the task of my old age to put a stop to national chauvinism. At last, my day has ended, and now in the evening, I sing my last song to say that I have loved your world. In 1947, 6 years after his death, India chose his words for its national anthem. And then from independence. So how influential he was. It ends with the words, victory to thee, capital T, to thee, not victory for India, but for every people in every nation, victory for the God within us all. Albert Schweitzer said of Rabindranath Tagore, this completely noble and harmonious thinker belongs not only to his own people, but to all. And John Phillip Newall reminds us, he showed us a world wisdom that belongs to all human beings and to the whole community of Earth, not simply to one nation, one religion, one race, or one species. We are all called to be twice, first in your own home and nation, and then born again to the larger world. It is when our individual self becomes our world self, that when our soul finds its true home in the soul of humanity and the soul of Earth, rather than simply in the soul of our own tribe. At the end of each chapter, there is a little meditation. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time in meditation, following this one that has been written by John Phillip Newall. It is not Tagore's words, but it is to help us think about Tagore's words, his influence on the world, and his influence on how we see spirituality in all of God's creation, not just us. He calls in us to free ourselves from the limitations of self and nation, of religion and race, that we may join the one song, the world song that is deep in the human soul and the soul of the earth. So let's pause and listen to these words and what Tagore's wisdom stirs in us. As truth longs to be known, so my soul longs for wisdom, that I may see the sun behind all suns, the eternal light in every light, and be a dreamer of dreams in this world, a singer of love's song, ever new and everlasting. Now let us pause to be aware. As truth longs to be known, so my soul longs for wisdom. Let it be so. So we have a few minutes, and I think just not necessarily ask questions because I don't know any answers, but to just think about what it is that Tagore has offered to us today in his writing and in his life, and how he connected with the people in the entire world through the words that he spoke and through his wisdom and in his search for wisdom. So what are your thoughts?
Number one, thanks for all your preparation and digestion. Name we've always heard about, but never knew ditch of wisdom. So thank you for that. But the insight, I think, for me is as in the word at the beginning. I mean, we get distracted by our own, what we think is our own wisdom or our culture's wisdom. And in doing so, the cage becomes more important than the singing of the bird. Educate the books that we stuff down the bird's throat become more important than nature. And so the importance of what is real and what is authentic in life is, I think, is good insight.
Thank you, Julie.
I was thinking, like he and Jesus using parables, and the power of story and indirection. And it threw me to thinking of the little girl that I'm working with in tutoring. And she's never had a chance to be in school before, but she comes in as a 9-year-old. And the classroom is set up, just like the cage, with the standards for a third grade class. But she doesn't have all the other preparation for it. But she has this wonderful spirit. While in the classroom, that wonderful spirit becomes a bother because she would like to be moving around and looking out and whatnot, rather than into the computer. But it's attention because there's a bit of I try to bring out her strength of her loving being in school and keep that alive. Oh, but also, how can she learn to read? So, you know, I was identifying totally with those teachers, like
Just the
up,
educator.
down the.
Right. And there are standards that you're
Can we
supposed to
please
meet,
do
right?
phonics one more time and one more way? And so how to combine the two is really not clip her wings. But so it's
And
not-
Tagore was actually that student and was in school and could not handle school, and therefore his father homeschooled him. But the other two children actually were they were taught in whatever was the standard school for the Brahmin society. But he could not. And
like Einstein.
he was
That was
It's a
his
good
point,
exercise.
that the bird basically represents one culture, basically clipping wings, beating, force feeding another culture.
and impose
Well, of course,
our
they're
standards
caged, they're caged.
upon everyone else. And that's what we have always done in the West. Taken over other cultures and then expected them to release all of their identity to become the identity of expectation that we.
It's a metaphor for the Indian schools and the Chinese schools that we did here. And it's the way it's done. And the creative student has to find a way to stay alive in that. And a lot of birds die.
It was amazing how connected he was to people coming from the background that he came from, which was completely separate. The only time he was in the fields was as the Lord. He was never field hand, and yet he was able to identify with those fields. He was able to identify with the lifestyle of those who were in the caste system that were far lower.
And he and Gandhi fought really hard for the Dalits to try to get them some rights, which obviously didn't work out terribly effectively, but that was one of their major goals besides freedom from the Brits.
Right. Any other thoughts?
The image of God with dust all over his garment. At first I thought it was the color of the, what was the character that God comes?
When he was writing about, he was
Someone
writing
looking
to
at
the
it.
people who were the religious order of the day. And he was saying, you know, it doesn't hurt to let your tattered clothes become tattered and to stand in the soil, as did he, capital He, which was Jesus. That he stood in the dust and the soil with tattered clothing with the people.
And then look at the disconnect. So Jesus was poor. He lived among the people. He didn't have any fancy clothes or fancy carriages. And look at our churches and look at our priests and look at our leaders. They totally misread the Bible and every other religious text that they're in. And it really has become empire.
It has. Yes. And has become empire since 500 BC. I mean, AD.
Over 312.
That was,
Or, no,
that was when,
was when they had to vote.
oh, help me with the name,
Of the example. Oh, Constantine?
Constantine.
Yeah,
That's when Constantine
won the vote.
made the religion, because he was Christian.
Right.
He made the religion national
So
religion.
there was the Eastern and the Western, and the Westerns won the vote partly because some people walked out. And then he made it a way to control the Serbs. Because they
So
could
it
go to
became
heaven
empire.
after they had this horrible life.
And all we have to do is look today at Christian nationalists.
Yes,
Or we can even look at First Presbyterian, because it's always easy to look at others. But what do we have that is established that is not really the point that Jesus was making? We come in our pretty clothes. My mother always said, we put on our Sunday best. Why are we not putting on a Sunday best? If not for others to see us, rather than for us to just come in whatever you woke up with, your pajamas.
It's rather, I was gonna say gutsy or courage filled for him to speak out as he did. Of course, he had, you know, the sense of self coming from being a Brahmin, you could do anything you wanted, but to take on the Western world and its filter and therefore denial of the Christian message, the filter of power and all the trappings that go with that, and to call that out is really very courageous. I mean, just to stand.
Yeah, and he was not ever punished for it, which is interesting, because we do read about people who have stood up against the establishment who were punished. And he was not, because A, he was a Brahmin, B, he was poet laureate, C, he was knighted by the British. So those kinds of things gave him the established recognition and respect. So he never was, even when he renounced his knighthood, he never was punished for that. And then his birthday message could be read to the world. And 6 years later, there was Indian independence.
You probably have seen Representative Al Green's address to the world. And I'm touched by the same kind of courage and the same kind of diplomatic skill in which he said, if I were sitting in the seats today and voting whether or not to censor a congressperson who had spoken out as I did during the State of the Union, I would vote yes. Nevertheless, I am standing here to say why I spoke out, and then so articulate. And the scene before that, when they were reading his censorship, and then the group began to sing around him, "We shall overcome." And the Speaker of the House did not know what to do. I mean, he kept saying, should I cut this off? Should I pound the, as "we shall overcome"? I don't think
Take
so.
a recess.
And so he says, recess. And that's
how
all
you
he
control the crowd.
all he could do in the situation. Of course, it was enough to empty the room, but the power of integrity standing there, will have reverberation. So,
And I'm wondering, will we not see more? Will there not be, the more people are willing to stand up against it and resist what's happening, will there not be more who will be emboldened?
I think
To
they will
resist.
be. I mean, if you go back 40, 50 years, multiple times, even in this country, people stood. So, you can go back to the 60s and then you can go back to the teens, and it happens over and over here. People forget that we did this, and we will again, because it really is totally outrageous. We do need to clean up Christianity though, because it's a tool.
It is a tool.
Yes, right.
It is a tool.
It's super, I mean, sitting here, since we're in church now, it needs to be fixed. The main churches really need to admit
And
that
that's, I
they're
think
not
that might be
using-
part of the reason that I am such a proponent of meditation and contemplation.
well, meditation is what we all should be doing, and he made that point, and Gandhi made that point, and lots of people have made that point.
Listening, because we don't have the answers. We always think we have the answers, but we don't have the answers. And listening in the silence with an open heart, that spirit can speak to us, will give us the messages that we need to hear instead of the messages that we are hearing. And there are messages all around us that are the wrong messages. So,
But the messages are the cage. We need the cage. We need to have people, behave properly and dress properly and not speak
The
out.
parrot.
Yeah, that's really important for us to understand that that's a big metaphor.
I think one thing that's so interesting is that, and it comes out in the story of the bird, we are so convinced that we are right. And what is right for you. And yet the bird died and nobody cared. And, I see that really happening significantly in this country where decisions are being made, people are losing jobs, they're losing their livelihood. And I haven't heard anybody that's making those decisions saying, I'm sorry. You've stopped becoming a person as far as I'm concerned. You're just a number. You need to get rid of it. And that's sad.
Well, I agree, but I also think that since they're calling themselves Christians, the main Christian church have to call them out.
But interestingly, the evangelical missionaries now are standing up
They are.
against
They are beginning to,
the
because,
end of USAID.
because their work got cut
Yeah.
by USAID.
But
Yeah.
what's interesting to me is that if you really look, I think that Jesus figured out how to be effective. He found the strategies that worked for that time. And he went around to all the fishermen and he walked the roads and he went to the towns and he gave his message and people followed him. And, over time, the course of his lifetime, the message he gave and his death changed the entire world. So I think it's always interesting to me, there's sort of a tension between your spiritual transformation but then now we're at a time, how do we be effective in the world around us? Because, it's important, I think, to have compassion for the many, many people that are suffering, but we've got to figure out a way that's effective to move to a different place for our society.
and I think that's why Tagore was so effective. He knew how to use the words, and he knew his audiences, and he knew all of the audiences. I mean, the things he was saying about the West, that Westerners were listening to and paying attention to, that the British listened to. He was really the same thing that Jesus was saying, you hypocrites. He was just as brave with that. But he was given, and he said it was God's work. It was God's will that he be traveling and that he be in the Western part of the world and say the things that he says, because God was using. And I think that we have to pay attention to that. When is God calling us to do something that we can't really do? Never. God only calls you because you have been graced with whatever skills or whatever abilities to be used. We just have to be willing to be used. But we have to listen first. That's my goal, is to help us understand. We don't know what is God's will unless we are listening. And that comes in the time when we are in the quiet with God and listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.